By the time of her arrest in the May raids, she had spent nearly her entire inheritance on purchases that investigation revealed were worthless outside the artificial market created by the criminal network. But Catherine's case was remarkable not for its exploitation techniques, which were repeated throughout the journal with mechanical consistency, but for what happened after her arrest. Unlike many network participants who collapsed psychologically when confronted with evidence of their manipulation, Catherine channeled her rage at being deceived into cooperation with authorities that proved devastatingly effective. Catherine possessed intimate knowledge of a network operations from the customer perspective, but she also had something equally valuable: detailed understanding of how the organization had infiltrated legitimate high society. Her social connections and aristocratic background had given her access to information that working class, addicts, and struggling artists never possessed. She knew which embassy officials had been compromised, which banking executives had facilitated money laundering, and which cultural institutions had been corrupted by network influence. Her testimony revealed that the cafe-based operations were only the visible portion of a criminal enterprise that extended into the highest levels of European society. Network operators had used their control over addicted aristocrats and wealthy expatriates to gain access to information and influence that could be monetized far beyond simple drug trafficking. Blackmail schemes targeted government officials, industrial espionage operations gathered intelligence for foreign competitors, and financial manipulation schemes moved money through international markets in ways that benefited criminal organizations throughout Europe. The scope of these secondary operations transformed the investigation from a local drug enforcement matter into an international security crisis. French authorities discovered that network operators had been selling information about military contracts, diplomatic negotiations, and industrial innovations to buyers whose identities remained hidden behind layers of intermediaries and coded communications. The cafe addicts had unknowingly served as intelligence assets whose social connections and family relationships provided access to secrets that could influence everything from stock prices to international treaties. Catherine's revelations about the network's intelligence operations led to one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire investigation. Prince Alessandro de Montecroce's heir to one of Italy's oldest noble families and a frequent visitor to Parisian cafe society had been systematically feeding information about Italian military preparations to network operators who were selling it to German intelligence services still operating despite the war's official conclusion. Alejandro's recruitment had followed the same pattern documented throughout the journal: initial contact through seemingly accidental encounters, gradual introduction to drugs through cultural activities, and steady escalation of both addiction and financial exploitation. But Alejandro's political connections had made him valuable for purposes that extended far beyond the money he could provide through inflated art purchases. Network operators had encouraged Alessandro's drug dependency, specifically to compromise his judgment and loyalty to his own country. His addiction had made him desperate for continued access to heroin, while his social position provided access to military and diplomatic information that foreign intelligence services were willing to pay enormous sums to obtain. The cafe operators served as intermediaries in transactions that generated profits far exceeding anything possible through simple drug dealing. Alejandro's case revealed how the network had evolved from criminal enterprise to national security threat. The systematic targeting of individuals with access to sensitive information suggested coordination with foreign intelligence services that were using criminal organizations to gather intelligence while maintaining plausible deniability about their activities. The cafe operators weren't just drug dealers. They were assets in an international espionage network that used addiction and cultural manipulation to compromise the security of multiple European nations. The discovery of these intelligence operations triggered a diplomatic crisis that reverberated through European capitals. Governments that had initially viewed the Parisian cafe scandal as a local law enforcement matter suddenly recognized that their own national security had been compromised by criminal organizations operating under the cover of artistic culture. Intelligence agencies that had been focused on traditional military threats found themselves confronting a new form of espionage that exploited cultural exchange and social relationships rather than traditional diplomatic channels. The investigation's expansion into intelligence matters also revealed how the network's financial operations had been far more sophisticated than initially understood. Money generated through drug sales and art fraud had been invested in legitimate businesses. that provided both cover for criminal activities and additional sources of revenue that could be used to expand operations. Network operators had purchased shares in shipping companies that transported their contraband, invested in banks that laundered their money, and acquired real estate that served as operational bases while generating rental income. Most disturbing was the discovery that network profits had been used to establish similar operations in other European cities. The Parisian café system was revealed to be a prototype for criminal organizations that were being replicated in London, Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. Each new operation had been refined based on lessons learned from the Paris experiment, making them more efficient at identifying targets, more sophisticated in their manipulation techniques, and more resistant to law enforcement detection. The international expansion of café-based criminal operations created enforcement challenges that existing law enforcement agencies were poorly equipped to address. Police departments that were organized to handle local crime found themselves confronting criminal networks that operated across national boundaries and used legitimate cultural institutions as cover for illegal activities. Traditional investigative techniques that relied on informants and surveillance were inadequate for addressing organizations that use psychological manipulation and social relationships rather than violence and intimidation to control their territories and victims. The complexity of these challenges was illustrated by the case of Dr. Hermann Weiss, a respected psychiatrist from Vienna who had been drawn into the network through his legitimate research into the therapeutic potential of various drugs. Weiss had initially visited Parisian cafes to observe how artists used substances to enhance creativity, hoping to develop treatments for patients suffering from depression and anxiety disorders that traditional medicine seemed unable to address effectively. Weiss's scientific training and medical credentials had made him an ideal target for network operators who recognized the value of having a legitimate medical professional associated with their activities. His presence in cafe society provided credibility that helped attract other potential customers, while his psychiatric expertise could be used to develop more effective manipulation techniques for targeting vulnerable individuals. The network had gradually compromised Weiss through techniques that exploited his genuine desire to help patients and advance medical knowledge. He was encouraged to experiment with increasingly powerful drugs, initially for research purposes, but eventually to satisfy his own growing addiction. His medical practice in Vienna became a source of pharmaceutical supplies that were diverted to network operations, while his patient relationships provided access to wealthy individuals who could be targeted for recruitment. Have you ever heard of a criminal network so sophisticated that it could turn good people into criminals without them even realizing it? This isn't a movie plot. It's a chilling reality uncovered in a case that shakes our understanding of crime, psychology, and free will. The story revolves around a psychiatrist, let's call him Dr. Weiss, who believed he was conducting groundbreaking medical research. He was driven by altruism, a desire to help people and advance human knowledge. But this very noble motivation was twisted and used against him. A shadowy organization, known only as the Network, manipulated him so skillfully that he became a key player in their criminal enterprise. Even after his arrest, faced with undeniable evidence, Weiss couldn't accept the truth. He was convinced his work was for the greater good, a testament to the profound level of psychological control the network had over him. This case wasn't just about one man's deception. It was the tip of the iceberg, revealing a terrifying evolution in criminal methodology. The network had weaponized psychology. They didn't just target individuals with greed or personal weaknesses. They learned to exploit professional ethics and the very best of human intentions. Weiss's psychiatric expertise was ironically turned against society. He was manipulated into developing recruitment protocols to identify vulnerable people based on their behavior. He helped create manipulation scripts that even untrained operatives could use to control targets effectively. These weren't just simple tricks, they were systems designed to maintain loyalty and compliance, even when people started suspecting something was wrong. This was psychological manipulation on an industrial scale, designed to be applied to entire populations, not just one person at a time. Law enforcement was completely unprepared for this. Traditional policing focuses on catching criminals after they've broken the law. You commit a crime, you get punished. Simple. But how do you fight an organization that doesn't just commit crimes, but creates criminals? The network had developed a system for manufacturing accomplices. They could take ordinary law-abiding citizens and manipulate them into committing acts they would normally find horrifying. all while making them believe they were doing something legitimate and even noble. This raises some deeply unsettling questions. If someone is psychologically manipulated into committing a crime, are they a perpetrator or a victim? Where does their responsibility end and the manipulators begin? Our entire legal system is built on the idea of individual choice and free will. But what happens when that free will is systematically hijacked? These weren't just philosophical debates for a university classroom. They became urgent, practical problems for investigators. As they dug deeper, they found a vast web of unwitting collaboration. Think about it. Gallery owners who thought they were just selling art to passionate collectors were actually laundering money for the network. Bank officials who processed strange, large transactions believed they were just providing good service to eccentric but valued clients. In some instances, even police officials were manipulated. They were convinced they were protecting artistic freedom and cultural expression, when in reality, they were turning a blind eye to a massive criminal operation. The scale of it was staggering. It suggested the network's power didn't just come from being clever criminals. It came from exploiting the very fabric of a civilized society. Trust. The network's true genius was its camouflage. By wrapping their illegal activities in the respectable cloaks of art, culture, and science, they could operate in plain sight. They didn't recruit from the dregs of society. They recruited from its most respected and well-intentioned members: doctors, artists, financiers, academics. People who were pillars of their communities were turned into unknowing cogs in a criminal machine. When the truth finally came out, the damage was immense. It wasn't just about the crimes committed or the money stolen. It was about the shattering of trust. People who had dedicated their lives to doing good discovered their best intentions had been weaponized. This created a crisis of confidence that rippled through society. If you can't trust a doctor, a banker, or an art dealer, who can you trust? The network showed that the line between good and evil, victim and perpetrator, can be deliberately and systematically blurred. They exploited our assumptions, our desire to believe the best in people, and our professional codes of conduct. It's a dark chapter that forces us to re-evaluate our own vulnerabilities. It's not always the person with obvious flaws who is at risk. Sometimes, it's the person with the strongest convictions and the purest intentions who is the most attractive target for a new breed of manipulator. The story of Dr. Weiss and the network is a stark reminder that the battle for our minds is real, and the enemies are not always who we think they are. It proves that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, but the ability to control what someone believes to be true. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating and frightening as I did, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of our world. This crisis was exemplified by the case of Father Michel Dubois, a Catholic priest whose genuine desire to help troubled young people had been exploited to provide network operators with access to vulnerable individuals from respectable families. Father Dubois had established a program that offered counseling and support to young people struggling with what he understood to be spiritual and emotional difficulties resulting from the war's psychological trauma. Network operators had identified Father Dubois's program as an ideal source of potential recruits who possessed both emotional vulnerability and family resources that could be exploited. They had gradually infiltrated his counseling sessions through individuals who posed as reformed addicts, seeking spiritual guidance while actually gathering intelligence about other participants who might be suitable targets for recruitment. The manipulation of Father Dubois had been particularly sophisticated because it exploited his religious convictions rather than challenging them. Network operatives had convinced him that helping troubled young people required understanding their struggles through direct experience, gradually leading him to believe that limited experimentation with drugs was necessary for effective ministry to addicted individuals. Father Dubois's involvement had provided network operators with both legitimacy and access that would have been impossible to obtain through purely criminal means. His endorsement of certain individuals as spiritually reformed had convinced families to trust people who were actually network operatives. His religious authority had been used to present drug experimentation as spiritual exploration rather than criminal activity. Most tragically, his genuine care for troubled young people had been weaponized to facilitate their exploitation by criminal organizations that viewed them as nothing more than sources of revenue. The revelation of Father Dubois's manipulation created a scandal within the Catholic Church that reverberated throughout France's religious communities. If respected clergy could be deceived into facilitating criminal exploitation of vulnerable individuals, How could any institution trust its ability to distinguish between legitimate social service and criminal manipulation? The case forced religious organizations throughout Europe to examine their own vulnerability to infiltration by criminal enterprises that might exploit their altruistic missions for illegal purposes. The broader implications of systematic manipulation became even more troubling as investigators discovered evidence that network operators had been documenting their techniques for potential sale to other criminal organizations or foreign intelligence services. Detailed manuals found in raided locations contained step-by-step instructions for identifying vulnerable targets, techniques for psychological manipulation that could be applied in various cultural contexts, and organizational structures that could be adapted to different legal and social environments. These manuals represented a form of criminal intellectual property that could be used to replicate network operations in any location with suitable populations of wealthy, psychologically vulnerable individuals. The techniques that had been developed through years of experimentation in Parisian cafes could be applied to exploit similar populations in other cities, creating a potential epidemic of criminal organizations that used cultural manipulation rather than traditional violence to achieve their goals. The existence of these instructional materials also suggested that network operators had been planning expansion on a scale that would have transformed them from regional criminal enterprise to international threat capable of influencing political and economic systems throughout Europe. Have you ever felt like someone was pulling your strings, making you doubt your own mind? It's a chilling feeling, and today we're diving deep into the dark world of psychological manipulation, specifically how criminals use it as a weapon. This isn't just about simple persuasion, it's a calculated strategy to control and exploit. We'll uncover their methods, not to create fear, but to empower you with knowledge, because understanding the game is the first step to refusing to play. First up, let's talk about the foundation of all manipulation: information gathering. Before a manipulator makes their move, they study you. They are masters of observation, picking up on your insecurities, your desires, and your vulnerabilities. They might do this through seemingly innocent conversations, asking personal questions that feel like genuine interest, or they'll watch your social media, learning about your friends, your hobbies, your dreams, and your fears. They're building a psychological profile, a user manual for your mind. Every piece of information you share is a potential tool they can use against you later. It's a quiet, patient process, and you often won't even realize it's happening until it's too late. Once they have their intel, the grooming process begins. This is where they build a foundation of trust. They'll mirror your behaviors, echo your opinions, and shower you with praise and affection. This is often called love bombing. It feels incredible, like you've finally met someone who truly understands you. They create an intense, whirlwind connection, making you feel special and adored. The goal here is to lower your defenses and make you emotionally dependent on them. They become your confidant, your biggest supporter, the one person you feel you can truly rely on. This manufactured bond is the key that unlocks your trust, giving them access to your emotions and decisions. With trust established, the manipulator starts to isolate you from your support network. This is a critical step in gaining total control. They'll subtly plant seeds of doubt about your friends and family. They might say things like, "Your friend seems a bit jealous of our connection," or "I don't think your family really has your best interests at heart like I do." They create small conflicts, making you feel like you have to choose between them and your loved ones. Over time, you might find yourself pulling away from the very people who could offer you a reality check. The manipulator wants to be the only voice you hear, the only opinion that matters. Isolation makes you more vulnerable and easier to control because there's no one else to tell you that what's happening isn't normal. Now we enter one of the most insidious phases: gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of psychological abuse where the manipulator makes you question your own sanity, your perception of reality, and your memories. They will blatantly deny things they said or did. You'll say, "You said you'd be here at 7, and they'll respond with absolute conviction, "No, I never said that. You must be remembering it wrong." They might hide your keys and then help you look for them, making you feel forgetful and incompetent. This constant erosion of your reality is incredibly damaging. It makes you feel like you're going crazy, that you can no longer trust your own mind. You start to rely on the manipulator to define reality for you, which is exactly what they want. They become the architect of your world. Alongside gaslighting, they use a technique of alternating kindness and cruelty. This creates a powerful and addictive cycle of abuse, often referred to as intermittent reinforcement. One moment, they are the loving, charming person you fell for. The next, they are cold, critical, or even aggressive. This unpredictability keeps you on edge, constantly trying to win back their approval and return to the good times. It's a psychological roller coaster that creates a strong, trauma-based bond. You become addicted to the highs of the cycle, willing to endure the lows to get that next hit of affection. This is how people become trapped in abusive situations, always hoping the good person will return for good, but they never do. As their control deepens, they begin to chip away at your self-esteem. They use constant, subtle criticism, often disguised as jokes or helpful advice. They might mock your clothes, your intelligence, or your ambitions. "Oh, you're wearing that. It's a bold choice." Or, "Are you sure you're cut out for that promotion?" It seems like a lot of pressure. These aren't overt attacks, but a steady drip of negativity designed to make you feel worthless. A person with low self-esteem is less likely to fight back, less likely to leave, and more likely to believe they deserve the mistreatment. They need you to feel small so they can feel big. Eventually, the manipulator will use threats and intimidation to maintain control. These threats might not always be physical. They can be emotional or financial. They might threaten to leave you, knowing you've become dependent on them. They might threaten to spread lies about you to your colleagues or what's left of your friends. In cases of financial abuse, they might threaten to cut you off, leaving you with no resources. The fear of these consequences is a powerful chain. It paralyzes you, making the thought of leaving seem impossible and more dangerous than staying. The manipulator has now built a prison around you, and the bars are made of fear, dependency, and self-doubt. So, how do you protect yourself? The first and most powerful tool is awareness. Recognizing these tactics for what they are is half the battle. Trust your gut. If a relationship feels off, if you constantly feel confused, anxious, or devalued, pay attention to that feeling. It's your internal alarm system. Maintain strong connections with your friends and family. Your support network is your lifeline. Don't let anyone isolate you. And most importantly, know your worth. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. No one has the right to diminish you or control you. If you recognize these patterns in your own life, or in the life of someone you know, please understand that it is not your fault. These manipulators are incredibly skilled at what they do. The most important step is to seek help. Talk to a trusted friend, a family member, or a professional therapist. There are hotlines and organizations dedicated to helping people in these situations.
Ever wondered how a single lie can topple a government? Or how a carefully crafted rumor can sway an election? Today, we're diving deep into the shadowy world where crime meets politics. We're talking about the intersection of criminal manipulation and political intelligence, a place where the fate of nations can be decided not in parliaments or voting booths, but in the back alleys of the internet and the hushed conversations of spies. Let's start with a basic concept: political intelligence. This isn't just about knowing what your rival is planning for their campaign. It's a vast field that includes everything from open-source data analysis like tracking public opinion on social media to covert operations that governments use to understand foreign threats and opportunities. It's the art and science of gathering information to make strategic political decisions. Traditionally, this was the domain of national intelligence agencies, diplomats, and political strategists. But what happens when criminal elements enter this high-stakes game? This is where things get truly fascinating and frightening. Criminal organizations, from mafia-style syndicates to sophisticated cybercrime rings, have realized that influencing politics is incredibly profitable. Why bribe a single customs officer when you can install a friendly politician who will change the entire import-export law in your favor? Why engage in petty extortion when you can manipulate public opinion to destabilize a region, creating a power vacuum you can exploit? This convergence creates a toxic brew. Criminals bring their expertise in manipulation, coercion, and violence. They are masters of the dark arts, blackmail, disinformation, and intimidation. When they apply these skills to the political arena, the very foundations of democracy are threatened. Think about it: a politician's career can be destroyed by a strategically leaked, completely fabricated scandal. An entire election can be influenced by a flood of fake news stories designed to enrage and divide the population. This is not science fiction. This is happening right now, all over the world. So how do they do it? The methods are as varied as they are insidious. One of the most powerful tools is disinformation. This goes way beyond simple lies. It's about creating a whole alternative reality. Cybercrime units, sometimes state-sponsored, sometimes working for the highest bidder, create networks of fake social media accounts, bogus news websites, and armies of bots. Their goal is to amplify certain narratives, drown out dissenting voices, and create an illusion of widespread support or opposition for a particular candidate or policy. They prey on our cognitive biases, our tendency to believe information that confirms what we already think. Before we know it, we're sharing a story that was designed from the ground up to manipulate us. Then there's the more direct approach. Kompromat, it's a Russian term for compromising materials. This is classic blackmail, supercharged for the digital age. Hackers might break into a politician's personal email, looking for anything embarrassing or illegal. They might use honey traps, luring a target into a compromising situation and secretly recording it. The goal isn't always to release the information. Often, the mere threat of exposure is enough. A compromised politician becomes a puppet, forced to vote a certain way, leak sensitive information, or sabotage their own government, all to keep their secrets from seeing the light of day. This turns public servants into private assets for criminal enterprises. And let's not forget the old-fashioned methods. Direct bribery, illegal campaign financing, and voter intimidation are still very much in play. Criminal groups can offer a candidate a suitcase full of cash in exchange for future favors. They can flood a campaign with dark money, untraceable funds that give them enormous influence. In some places, they might go door to door, not to ask for votes, but to threaten people into voting for a particular candidate, or not voting at all. When crime and politics mix, the ballot box can become just another tool of coercion. The impact on society is devastating. First and foremost, it erodes trust. When we can't tell what's real and what's fake, when we suspect our leaders are being blackmailed or bought, our faith in the entire democratic process crumbles. We become cynical and disengaged, which ironically, makes it even easier for manipulative actors to seize control. Apathy is the manipulator's best friend. It also leads to terrible policy. Imagine a government where key decisions about public health, the economy, or national security are being made not for the public good, but to benefit a criminal organization. Laws get passed that favor money launderers. Environmental regulations are weakened to help illegal polluters. Justice systems are corrupted to protect criminals and punish their enemies. The result is a society that doesn't work for its citizens, but for a hidden network of crooks. This unholy alliance also fuels instability. Criminal groups often thrive in chaos. By using disinformation and other tactics to stoke social, ethnic, or political divisions, they can weaken a country from within. They pit neighbor against neighbor, creating an environment of fear and uncertainty. In this environment, people are more likely to turn to strongman leaders who promise simple solutions, even if it means giving up their freedoms. The criminals, meanwhile, profit from the chaos, expanding their illicit businesses in the shadows. So what can we do? It feels like a massive, overwhelming problem, but we are not helpless. The first and most important step is awareness. Just by understanding these tactics, we're already building a defense. When you see a shocking political headline, take a second. Ask yourself, who is behind this? What is their motive? Is this designed to inform me, or to inflame me? Developing this kind of critical thinking is our primary shield against disinformation. Media literacy is crucial. We need to teach ourselves and our children how to spot fake news, how to check sources, and how to understand the difference between journalism and propaganda. Support independent, fact-based journalism. These are the institutions that act as a watchdog, exposing corruption and holding power to account. When their funding dries up, the darkness rushes in to fill the void. On a governmental level, we need stronger cybersecurity. We need to protect our electoral infrastructure from hackers. We need robust laws on campaign finance transparency to cut off the flow of dark money. And we need international cooperation, because these criminal networks don't respect borders. Intelligence agencies need to work together to track and disrupt these plots, sharing information about threats. And finally, we need to demand integrity from our leaders. We must hold them to the highest ethical standards and refuse to accept corruption as just business as usual. We need to build a political culture where honesty and public service are valued above all else. This starts with us, in our communities, in our conversations, and in the choices we make at the ballot box. The fusion of criminal manipulation and political intelligence is one of the defining challenges of our time. It's a battle for the soul of our democracies, fought on the invisible battlefield of information. But by arming ourselves with knowledge, critical thinking, and a renewed commitment to democratic values, we can fight back. We can ensure that our future is shaped by the will of the people, not the whispers of criminals in the shadows. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this topic as important as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this video to help spread awareness. What do you think is the biggest threat to our political systems today? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, and stay informed. The heroin havens of 1920s. Paris had become a laboratory for techniques of social manipulation that would echo through history long after. The last cafe had been closed and the final participant had faced justice for their role in one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies of the modern era. The investigation's tentacles reached into the most unexpected corners of European society, revealing how the network had systematically targeted not just individuals, but entire institutions that formed the backbone of civilized order. As spring arrived in Paris in 1929, Detective Inspector Bertrand discovered that the corruption extended into realms that shocked even his cynical sensibilities. The breakthrough came through Countess Isabella von Habsburg, a legitimate Austrian aristocrat whose addiction had made her a willing accomplice in schemes that threatened the very foundations of European banking. Isabella's story began in the autumn of 1926 when she arrived in Paris. Fleeing a marriage scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Vienna's conservative social circles. At 35, she possessed both the sophistication to navigate high society and the desperation that made her vulnerable to exploitation. Isabella's recruitment had been orchestrated by someone calling himself Baron Friedrich von Zeckendorf, whose noble credentials were as fabricated as his charm was genuine. The Baron understood that Isabella's disgrace in Austrian society had created a hunger for acceptance that could be satisfied through association with Paris' avant-garde cultural movements. He introduced her to café society as a refuge where her past scandals would be viewed as evidence of sophisticated rebellion rather than moral failure. The Baron's manipulation of Isabella was masterful in its subtlety. He never directly encouraged her drug use, but created social situations where abstinence would have meant isolation from the only community in Paris that seemed to understand her situation. Isabella's first injection occurred during what she believed was an intimate artistic salon where drug use was presented as necessary for appreciating experimental poetry that challenged conventional literary boundaries. Within months, Isabella's addiction had progressed to the point where maintaining her habit required increasingly desperate financial measures. Her family's Austrian properties provided collateral for loans that were channeled through network-controlled banks, creating paper trails that disguised drug transactions as legitimate business investments. But Isabella's value to the network extended far beyond her personal wealth. Through her Habsburg connections, Isabella possessed access to information about European royal families, diplomatic negotiations, and financial arrangements that could influence everything from currency values to territorial disputes. Network operators encouraged her to maintain correspondence with relatives and family friends throughout the Austrian Empire, using her letters to gather intelligence that was then sold to buyers whose identities remained hidden behind layers of intermediaries. Isabella's case revealed how the network had learned to exploit aristocratic social networks that had been weakened by the war, but still maintained enough influence to affect political and economic decisions.
In the shadows of Europe's grandest halls, a different kind of power was being traded. While noble families had lost their political grip, they still held the keys to a kingdom of secret social connections and insider knowledge that became the target of a brilliant and ruthless criminal mind. They called this figure the architect, an unseen puppet master who knew Europe's elite better than they knew themselves. The architect was a ghost, never seen, never heard, but their presence was undeniable. With an intimate understanding of noble genealogies, diplomatic protocols, and financial systems, they orchestrated a vast network from the shadows. Was this person an aristocrat themselves, or a rogue intelligence agent? No one knew for sure, but their methods were chillingly precise. Under their guidance, detailed maps of aristocratic relationships were drawn, identifying families with access to power and individuals with hidden vulnerabilities. The targeting was so surgical, it screamed professional intelligence training. This wasn't just common crime. It was a matter of international security. European intelligence agencies, initially dismissing the network as a simple criminal problem, were forced to confront a terrifying reality. Their own diplomatic and financial systems had been breached. The architects' organization possessed detailed intelligence on some of their most sensitive operations, turning cafe gatherings into command centers for economic warfare. The full scale of this compromise came to light through the tragic case of Lord Reginald Ashworth, a respected British diplomat. His addiction to opium, a secret weakness, was carefully nurtured and exploited by the network. They didn't just control him, they turned him into a source of priceless information. Ashworth's recruitment was a masterpiece of deception, beginning innocently during cultural exchanges between British and French art institutions, flying completely under the radar of security services focused on traditional spies. Through Ashworth, the network gained advanced knowledge of trade agreements, military treaties, and colonial policies. This wasn't about street-level crime. It was about high-stakes financial manipulation. The intelligence was sold to buyers who used it to rig commodity prices and currency values, generating profits far beyond anything drug trafficking could ever yield. This was a new breed of crime, where cultural infiltration unlocked immense economic power. The schemes were incredibly sophisticated, requiring a disturbing partnership between the criminal underworld and legitimate financial institutions across Europe. Banks handling suspicious transactions were duped into believing they were part of legitimate business deals. How the clients had impeccable aristocratic credentials and a veneer of cultural sophistication that masked their true criminal intentions. Investigators started to peel back the layers of this financial conspiracy. They discovered that the architects' network had been systematically infiltrating major banks for years. They didn't storm the gates. They quietly compromised employees from within, using the slow poisons of drug addiction and social pressure. The very institutions meant to safeguard Europe's economy were being hollowed out from the inside. This investigation was no longer just about catching criminals. It was a race against time to understand how deep the rot went, to uncover the identity of the architect, and to stop a shadow organization that had turned the very fabric of European high society into its most powerful weapon. The hunt for the architect became a desperate struggle to reclaim control, proving that in the modern world, the most dangerous threats don't always carry a gun. Sometimes they carry a title. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden world of global power. Bank clerks who frequented cafe society found themselves processing transactions that they were told involved art, sales, or cultural exchanges, while actually facilitating money-laundering operations that moved criminal profits through international financial systems. The banking infiltration was coordinated by Henry Lacoste's successor, a mysterious figure known as the Treasurer, who possessed expertise in international finance that allowed the Pitcher network to exploit regulatory gaps between different national banking systems. The Treasurer had established a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that made tracking criminal profits virtually impossible, while creating legitimate-appearing paper trails that satisfied banking compliance requirements. The sophistication of these financial operations suggested involvement by professionals with extensive experience in international banking and investment management. The network had recruited individuals from legitimate financial institutions who possessed both technical expertise and access to systems that could be exploited for criminal purposes. Their involvement had transformed simple drug trafficking into a complex financial conspiracy that threatened the integrity of European banking systems. The investigation of banking infiltration led to one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire case: evidence that network operators had been planning to use their financial capabilities to manipulate currency markets during periods of political instability. Documents found in raided locations contained detailed analyses of how drug profits could be leveraged to influence exchange rates during diplomatic crisis, potentially affecting the outcomes of international negotiations. These currency manipulation schemes would have required coordination with hostile foreign governments that possessed the resources and motivation to destabilize European financial systems. The network's operations had evolved from criminal enterprise to potential weapon of economic warfare that could be used to undermine the stability of democratic nations through manipulation of their financial systems. The recognition of these possibilities elevated the investigation to the highest levels of government throughout Europe. Intelligence services that had been focused on traditional military threats found themselves confronting a new form of asymmetric warfare that used criminal organizations and cultural infiltration rather than conventional military means to achieve strategic objectives. The complexity of these threats was illustrated by the case of Professor Ludwig Sippmann, a respected economist from the University of Berlin, whose addiction to cocaine had been exploited to provide network operators with detailed analyses of European financial systems and their vulnerabilities to manipulation. Zimmerman's academic credentials had given him access to confidential government economic data that network operators used to develop strategies for currency, speculation, and market manipulation. Zimmerman's recruitment had followed the familiar pattern of gradual compromise through cultural activities, but his case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit intellectual curiosity and academic ambition as effectively as personal trauma or financial desperation. His belief that he was contributing to important economic research had been manipulated to make him complicit in activities that contradicted everything he claimed to believe about honest scholarship and public service. The exploitation of academic institutions represented another dimension of the network's evolution from criminal enterprise to systematic threat against the foundations of civilized society. Universities and research institutions that should have served as sources of objective knowledge and critical thinking had been infiltrated by criminal organizations that used academic credibility to legitimize their activities while gathering intelligence that could be used for illegal purposes. The academic infiltration was particularly dangerous because it threatened the integrity of knowledge systems that democratic societies depended upon for informed decision-making. If criminal organizations could manipulate academic research and expert analysis, they could potentially influence public policy and social attitudes in ways that serve their criminal objectives while appearing to be based on legitimate scholarly authority. The investigation of academic compromise revealed that network operators had been systematically targeting universities and research institutions throughout Europe, identifying scholars whose work could be useful for criminal purposes and developing strategies for recruitment that exploited academic culture and professional incentives. The targeting was so systematic that investigators suspected coordination by intelligence professionals who understood how to exploit academic institutions for strategic advantage. The academic infiltration schemes were coordinated by an individual known as the scholar, whose identity remained hidden, but whose influence was evident in the sophisticated techniques used to compromise researchers and manipulate academic institutions. The scholar possessed intimate knowledge of academic culture and scholarly communication networks that suggested either extensive university experience or professional training in intelligence operations targeting academic institutions. Under the scholar's guidance, network operators had developed techniques for influencing academic research that could shape public side understanding of issues relevant to their criminal operations. Scholars who had been compromised through drug addiction or financial pressure found themselves producing research that supported policy positions favorable to criminal organizations while believing they were engaged in objective academic inquiry. The manipulation of academic research was particularly insidious because it exploited the trust that democratic societies placed in scholarly expertise and scientific methodology. Citizens who relied on academic authority to inform their political and social decisions were unknowingly influenced by research that had been corrupted by criminal organizations seeking to advance their illegal objectives. The discovery of academic manipulation created a crisis of confidence in intellectual institutions that extended far beyond the immediate participants in network activities. If respected scholars could be manipulated into producing corrupted research, how could society distinguish between legitimate knowledge and criminal propaganda disguised as academic authority? These questions became practically urgent as the investigation revealed that network-influenced research had been used to support policy positions that would have benefited criminal organizations while appearing to be based on objective scholarly analysis. Academic papers that advocated for reduced law enforcement funding, liberalized drug policies, and weakened financial regulations had been produced by scholars who were unknowingly serving criminal interests while believing they were advancing legitimate intellectual and policy goals. The extent of academic compromise was illustrated by the case of Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a respected criminologist from Cambridge University, whose research on drug policy had been systematically influenced by network operators who provided her with funding research subjects and data that supported conclusions favorable to their criminal objectives. Dr. Thornfield's academic reputation had given her research credibility that influenced policy discussions throughout Europe, while her compromised methodology had produced conclusions that served criminal rather than public interests. Dr. Thornfield's case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit academic funding systems and research methodologies to influence scholarly conclusions while maintaining the appearance of objective inquiry. Her addiction to heroin, which had developed through her research into drug use patterns, had made her dependent on network cooperation for continued access to research subjects and data, sources that were essential for her academic career. The manipulation of Dr. Thornfield's research had been so sophisticated that she never recognized how her scholarly objectivity had been compromised by her personal addiction and professional dependence on criminal organizations. Her belief that she was conducting important research that would inform humane drug policies had been manipulated to produce academic authority for positions that actually served criminal interests rather than public welfare. The revelation that respected academic research had been corrupted by criminal manipulation created a scandal that reverberated throughout European intellectual communities. Universities that had prided themselves on scholarly independence found themselves questioning whether their research had been compromised by criminal organizations that understood how to exploit academic culture and professional incentives. The academic scandal also revealed how network operators had been planning to use corrupted research to influence public policy discussions that could affect law, enforcement capabilities, and regulatory frameworks. Academic papers that advocated for policies favorable to criminal organizations had been strategically published and promoted to influence political debates about crime, drugs, and financial regulation. These influence operations represented a form of intellectual warfare that could potentially undermine democratic decision-making by corrupting the knowledge systems that informed public policy. If criminal organizations could manipulate academic research and expert analysis, they could potentially influence political outcomes in ways that serve their illegal objectives, while appearing to be based on legitimate scholarly authority. The recognition of these possibilities transformed the Café network investigation into a comprehensive examination of how criminal organizations could exploit the openness and trust that made democratic societies function effectively. The techniques that had been developed for manipulating individuals had been scaled up to target institutions and knowledge systems that were essential for civilized governance. As the investigation expanded to examine academic and institutional compromise, it became clear that the network's operations had been far more ambitious than simple criminal enterprise. The systematic targeting of cultural institutions, financial systems, political networks, and academic research suggested coordination by organizations that possess strategic objectives extending far beyond criminal profit. The possibility that the Café network had been serving foreign intelligence interests or political movements seeking to destabilize democratic societies created new urgency for investigation efforts that had already revealed more complexity than law enforcement agencies were equipped to handle. The heroin havens of Parisian cafes had been revealed as components of a sophisticated assault on the foundations of European civilization that would require unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement, intelligence services, and democratic institutions to address effectively. The network's participants found themselves caught in conflicts they had never understood. Their personal struggles with addiction and cultural alienation transformed into elements of larger battles over the future of democratic society. Their stories had become cautionary tales about the vulnerability of human freedom in an age when psychological manipulation and institutional corruption had become weapons that could be wielded by hostile forces seeking to undermine the foundations of civilized order. The investigation continued to reveal new dimensions of the conspiracy that suggested the full scope of the network's operations might never be completely understood. But the evidence already gathered had provided insights into the vulnerability of democratic institutions and open societies that would influence security policy and law enforcement practices for generations to come. The bohemian cafes where artists had sought inspiration through chemical enhancement had been revealed as laboratories for techniques of social manipulation and institutional corruption that would echo through history, long after the last participant had faced justice for their role in one of the most sophisticated threats to democratic civilization in the modern era. The spring of 1929 brought revelations that would forever change how European societies understood the relationship between cultural freedom and national security. The Café network had demonstrated that the very openness and tolerance that made democratic civilization worth preserving could be systematically exploited by hostile forces seeking to destroy the foundations of free society from within. Understanding and addressing these vulnerabilities would become one of the defining challenges of the 20th century as democratic nations struggled to preserve their values while defending against enemies who had learned to weaponize the trust and freedom that made those values possible. The investigation had reached a critical juncture when Detective Inspector Bertrand received an encrypted telegram from London that would transform everything he thought he understood about the Café network's true purpose. The message, sent through diplomatic channels by British intelligence, contained a single devastating revelation. The network's operations were being replicated simultaneously in 12 major European cities, suggesting coordination by an organization far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The telegram's contents were based on intelligence gathered by agent Sarah Whitmore, a British operative who had been conducting parallel investigations in London's Bloomsbury district. Whitmore had discovered that wealthy British expatriates were returning from Paris with more than just artistic inspiration and narcotic dependencies. They were carrying detailed instructions for establishing similar operations that could target Britain's aristocratic and intellectual elite through the same cultural manipulation techniques that had proven so effective in French café society. Agent Whitmore's investigation had begun when Lord Petan's youngest son Charles had died of a heroin overdose in his Mayfair apartment, surrounded by paintings that subsequent analysis revealed were worthless forgeries purchased for astronomical sums. Charles's death had initially been dismissed as another tragic example of aristocratic excess, but Whitmore's examination of his financial records revealed transaction patterns that mirrored those discovered in the Parisian investigation. Charles had spent the previous 18 months traveling between Paris and London, ostensibly pursuing his interests in avant-garde literature and experimental theatre, but his actual activities, reconstructed through painstaking investigation of his correspondence and financial dealings, revealed systematic recruitment of vulnerable individuals from Britain's most prominent families. His social connections had provided access to people whose psychological profiles matched those documented in the Peacher Network's targeting protocols. The British operation had been established in a series of private clubs and artistic salons that appeared to serve legitimate cultural purposes while actually functioning as recruitment centers for criminal activities. The Annium Society, housed in a Georgian mansion near Russell Square, had attracted young intellectuals and artists through lectures on contemporary European culture and exhibitions of work by promising continental artists. But the Society's real purpose was identifying and cultivating individuals who might be suitable for more intensive manipulation. The Society's operations were managed by someone calling herself Lady Vivian Ashcroft, whose aristocratic credentials were as fabricated as her interest in artistic patronage. Lady Ashcroft possessed intimate knowledge of British social hierarchies and cultural movements that allowed her to present herself as a sophisticated cultural authority while actually serving as a recruitment specialist for criminal organizations seeking to exploit British wealth and influence. Lady Ashcroft's manipulation techniques had been refined through experience with dozens of targets, each providing lessons that improved her ability to identify vulnerabilities and exploit them systematically. Her approach varied depending on the specific psychological profile of each target, but always involved gradual introduction to increasingly exclusive cultural activities where drug use was normalized through association with intellectual sophistication and artistic authenticity. The British operation's most significant success had been the recruitment of Sir Reginald Blackwood, a prominent banker whose position at the Bank of England had provided access to information about monetary policy and international financial agreements, while his belief that he was supporting important cultural initiatives had been manipulated to secure his cooperation with increasingly compromising requests for confidential information. Through Blackwood, the network had gained advanced knowledge of British currency policies and international trade agreements that allowed coordinated speculation in financial markets throughout Europe. The profits generated through this insider trading had been used to fund expansion of network operations while providing resources for more ambitious manipulation schemes, targeting government officials and military personnel. The British operation's financial sophistication had exceeded even the Parisian network's capabilities, demonstrating how criminal organizations could adapt their techniques to exploit the specific characteristics of different national financial systems. The coordination required for simultaneous market manipulation across multiple countries suggested involvement by organizations that possess both criminal expertise and strategic intelligence capabilities that extended far beyond simple profit motives. Agent Whitmore's investigation had also revealed connections between the British operation and political movements that were inciting to undermine public confidence in democratic institutions through systematic corruption of cultural and intellectual leadership. The network's targeting of university professors, literary critics, and political commentators had been designed to influence public opinion on issues ranging from drug policy to international relations. The political dimensions of the British operation had been coordinated by an individual known as the ideologist, whose identity remained hidden, but whose influence was evident in the sophisticated propaganda techniques used to manipulate public discourse. The ideologist possessed extensive knowledge of British political culture and media, systems that suggested either insider political experience or professional training in psychological warfare operations. Under the ideologist guidance, network operators had developed techniques for influencing political debates through manipulation of intellectual authorities and cultural leaders who shaped public opinion. Professors who had been compromised through drug addiction found themselves producing research that supported political positions favorable to criminal organizations, while believing they were engaged in objective scholarly inquiry. The manipulation of British political discourse had been particularly focused on issues related to law enforcement capabilities and international cooperation in addressing transnational crime. Academic papers and newspaper articles that advocated for reduced police powers and weakened international intelligence sharing had been produced by scholars and journalists who were unknowingly serving criminal interests while believing they were advancing legitimate political and policy goals. The discovery of systematic political manipulation created a crisis within British intelligence services that had been focused on traditional foreign threats while failing to recognize how domestic cultural institutions could be exploited by hostile organizations. The network's operations had demonstrated that open societies were vulnerable to forms of attack that used democratic freedoms and cultural tolerance as weapons against the systems they were designed to protect. Have you ever heard of the Coudenhove-Kalergi plan, or the idea that a shadowy elite is secretly trying to replace Europe's population? These aren't just whispers in dark corners of the internet. They're full-blown conspiracy theories that have captivated millions. But where do they come from, and why do they stick around? Today, we're diving deep into the world of European conspiracy theories, separating the bizarre from the believable. Let's start with one of the biggest, the Eurabia theory. This idea suggests that European leaders are secretly collaborating with Arab nations to Islamize the continent, creating a new superstate called Eurabia. Proponents point to immigration trends and political alliances as proof. However, historians and political scientists overwhelmingly debunk this. They argue that immigration is a complex global phenomenon driven by economics, conflict, and personal choice, not some grand, sinister plot. European policies, while often debated, are formed through messy democratic processes, not secret backroom deals to erase a continent's culture. Then, there's the aforementioned Coudenhove-Kalergi plan. Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi was a real person, an early advocate for European integration after World War I. He envisioned a united Europe to prevent future wars. Conspiracy theorists, however, twisted his writings, claiming he planned to create a mixed-race population easily controlled by a Jewish elite. This is a gross misinterpretation of his work, which was about political unity, not racial engineering. This theory often gets mixed with anti-Semitic tropes, recycling old, harmful ideas into a new, European-focused package. So why are these theories so popular? Well, they offer simple answers to complex problems. It's easier to blame a secret group of powerful people for economic anxiety, cultural changes, or political instability than it is to grapple with the messy reality of global trends. These stories provide a clear us versus them narrative, which can be very appealing when people feel uncertain or powerless. Social media algorithms also play a huge role, creating echo chambers where these ideas can spread like wildfire without any fact-checking or opposing viewpoints. It's also important to recognize that skepticism towards government is not always a bad thing. Holding power accountable is a cornerstone of democracy. But there is a huge difference between healthy skepticism and falling for baseless conspiracies that often target marginalized groups. When we see a headline or a video that makes a shocking claim, it's crucial to ask questions. Who is making this claim? What is their evidence? Are they trying to sell me something, or just make me angry? Instead of a secret cabal, the real story of Europe is one of constant change, negotiation, and debate. It's a continent shaped by centuries of migration, conflict, and cooperation. The challenges it faces today, like economic inequality, climate change, and political polarization, are real. But the solutions won't be found in elaborate fantasies about shadowy elites. They'll be found in open discussion, critical thinking, and a willingness to engage with the world as it is, not as we fear it might be. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown interesting, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. What other topics should we explore? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time. Ever wonder how the very people sworn to protect a nation can be turned against it? It's a chilling thought, and it happens more often than you'd think, using patriotism as the ultimate weapon. Take the case of a man named Weber. He believed he was a patriot, working to advance German interests. In reality, his skills and connections were being used by international criminal networks with zero loyalty to any country. They twisted his love for his nation to serve their own corrupt goals. This is a terrifying form of psychological manipulation, where the highest human ideals, like patriotism, are weaponized for the lowest criminal purposes. Imagine being a veteran. You've sacrificed everything for your country, only to find yourself unknowingly betraying it, all while thinking you're still serving a noble cause. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across post-war Europe, criminal networks specifically targeted former military personnel. Why? Because veterans possess a unique and dangerous combination: incredible operational skills, a deep-seated sense of duty, but also psychological vulnerabilities and a feeling of being displaced in a world they no longer recognize. This systematic recruitment wasn't just crime. It was a form of warfare against the very military institutions that democratic societies rely on for their defense. It's a quiet, insidious attack from within. The chaos following the collapse of old empires created the perfect breeding ground for this kind of subversion. Let's look at Vienna after the fall of the Habsburg Empire. The city was in turmoil. Traditional political and cultural structures had vanished, leaving a power vacuum. Criminal networks saw this as a golden opportunity. They didn't just want to commit crimes, they wanted to destabilize the new Austrian Republic by corrupting its fragile democratic institutions from the very beginning. Their targets were specific: displaced aristocrats and former government officials. People who had lost their status and were desperate to get it back. At the heart of the Vienna network was a man named Count Anton von Seck. He was a real aristocrat, which gave him the perfect cover. He could move in the highest circles, preying on the nostalgia and resentment of other noble families who had lost everything. He promised them a return to their former glory, a restoration of their influence. But the path he offered was one of crime and political subversion. He masterfully blended traditional criminal enterprises with a sophisticated campaign aimed at tearing down the new democracy before it could even stand on its own 2 feet. The Count's strategy was particularly insidious when it came to Austria's financial system. He knew that to control the country, he needed to control its money. So, he targeted former imperial bureaucrats, men who had intimate knowledge of the financial systems and regulatory loopholes. By recruiting these insiders, his network systematically infiltrated legitimate banks. This wasn't just about robbery. It was about creating a shadow economy. They orchestrated massive fraud and money laundering schemes, generating immense profits that were then funneled back into more ambitious plots to manipulate politics and undermine the government. It was a vicious cycle of crime, fueling, subversion, all hidden behind a veil of aristocratic legitimacy. This shows how criminal organizations can evolve, becoming political forces that threaten the very fabric of society. Thanks for watching, and if you found this insightful, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces that shape our world. The Austrian network's political dimensions had been coordinated with similar operations in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where parallel criminal organizations were working to destabilize the new democratic governments that had emerged from the Habsburg Empire's dissolution. The coordination between these operations suggested strategic planning by organizations that possessed both criminal expertise and political objectives that extended far beyond simple profit maximization. The revelation of coordinated political subversion throughout Central Europe created alarm within the new democratic governments that had struggled to establish legitimacy and stability in the aftermath of imperial collapse. The network's operations had exploited the very political transitions that were supposed to create more democratic and responsive governance, using the chaos of political change to establish criminal influence over emerging institutions. The scope of political manipulation was illustrated by the case of Dr. Franz Moravich, a respected economist who had been recruited to serve in the new Czechoslovak government as finance ministry, while secretly providing information to network operators who used his insider knowledge to manipulate currency markets and government bond prices. Moravec's belief that his involvement in network activities was serving Czech national interests had been systematically exploited to secure his cooperation with schemes that actually weakened the new nation's financial stability. Moravec's case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit nationalist sentiments and political idealism to recruit individuals whose positions in government provided access to information and influence that could be used for criminal purposes. His involvement in activities that he believed were advancing Czech independence had actually served the interests of international criminal organizations that profited from political instability and institutional corruption. The exploitation of political idealism represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the network's manipulation techniques, demonstrating how criminal organizations could corrupt the democratic processes that were essential for legitimate governance. Officials who had dedicated their lives to public service found themselves betraying the public trust while believing they were serving higher purposes that justified their involvement in increasingly compromising activities. The pattern of government infiltration was repeated throughout Europe, where network operators had systematically targeted the emerging democratic institutions that were replacing the imperial and monarchical systems destroyed by the war. The timing of these recruitment efforts suggested coordination by organizations that understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities created by political transition and institutional instability. By the summer of 1929, the investigation had revealed a conspiracy of such scope and sophistication that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of crime and the capabilities of criminal organizations. The Café network had been revealed as one component of a continental criminal enterprise that combined traditional illegal activities with systematic attacks on the cultural, financial, political, and military institutions that supported democratic civilization. The network's participants had become unwitting soldiers in a war against the foundations of free society. Their personal struggles with addiction and alienation transformed into weapons that could be used to undermine the very systems that should have provided them with security and opportunity. Their stories had become cautionary tales about the vulnerability of human nature and democratic institutions to systematic manipulation by organizations that possessed both criminal ruthlessness and strategic intelligence capabilities. The investigation's revelations had created unprecedented challenges for law enforcement and intelligence agencies that were organized to address traditional threats, while lacking capabilities for confronting criminal organizations that operated across national boundaries and exploited cultural and political freedoms for strategic purposes. The network's success had demonstrated that democratic societies needed new approaches to security that could preserve their openness while defending against enemies who had learned to weaponize the trust and freedom that made democratic life possible. As authorities throughout Europe struggled to comprehend the full scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered, one fact became increasingly clear. The heroin havens of Parisian cafes had been far more than criminal enterprises or artistic gathering places. They had been laboratories for developing techniques of psychological warfare and social manipulation that would continue to threaten democratic civilization long after the last participant had been brought to justice, and the final cafe had been shuttered forever. The network's legacy would extend far beyond the immediate participants in its criminal activities, influencing how democratic societies understood and defended against threats that exploited their greatest strengths as weapons for their destruction. The bohemian dreams that had drawn so many vulnerable souls into the network's web had been revealed as nightmares that threatened to consume not just individual lives, but the entire civilization that had made those dreams seem possible. In the shadowy corners of those smoke-filled rooms where needles passed between trembling fingers and artistic ambitions dissolved into chemical dependency, a new form of warfare had been born. The battle for the soul of European civilization would continue long after the cafes fell silent, fought not with conventional weapons, but with the more insidious tools of psychological manipulation and cultural corruption that the network had perfected. Through years of experimentation on some of history's most vulnerable and idealistic individuals, the investigation had revealed that the true target of the network's operations had never been simply money or drugs, but something far more precious: the trust, creativity, and idealism that made democratic civilization worth preserving. Understanding how these qualities had been systematically exploited and corrupted would be essential for protecting future generations from similar threats, while maintaining the cultural freedom and social openness that remained essential for human flourishing in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. The network's collapse marked the end of one chapter in the ongoing struggle between the forces of civilization and those who would exploit human weakness for destructive purposes. But the techniques and insights that had been developed through the systematic manipulation of cafe culture would continue to influence criminal organizations and hostile governments throughout the 20th century and beyond, creating challenges that democratic societies would struggle to address while preserving the values that made their way of life worth defending. The heroin havens had been closed, their participants scattered to rehabilitation centers, prisons, or early graves. But the knowledge of human vulnerability that had been gained through their operation would live on, a dark legacy of one of history's most sophisticated attempts to weaponize art, culture, and human creativity in service of forces that sought to destroy everything those qualities were meant to celebrate and preserve. The struggle to defend democratic civilization against such threats would continue, informed by hard-won understanding of how easily human nature could be exploited by those who possess both the will and the knowledge to transform society's greatest strengths into instruments of its potential destruction. The final act of this tragic symphony began in the autumn of 1929, when the global financial collapse that would become known as the Great Depression delivered the killing blow to a network already weakened by investigation and exposure. The stock market crash of October sent shockwaves through the wealthy families whose trust funds and investments had sustained the cafe operations, while the economic chaos that followed created conditions that made the network's sophisticated financial manipulations impossible to maintain. Lady Catherine Pembroke, whose cooperation with Detective Inspector Bertrand had helped expose the network's aristocratic connections, found herself facing a different kind of devastation as her family's textile fortune evaporated, along with millions of other investments. The inheritance that had made her such an attractive target for network operators no longer existed, leaving her to confront both her addiction and her exploitation, without the financial resources that had once seemed to guarantee her security. Catherine's recovery took place in a small clinic outside London, where she spent months learning to distinguish between the authentic relationships she was building with other patients and the manipulated connections that had defined her Paris experience. The process was complicated by her realization that some of her most treasured memories of artistic discovery and intellectual growth had been systematically manufactured by people who viewed her as nothing more than a source of revenue. The psychological damage extended far beyond simple addiction. Catherine had to reconstruct her entire understanding of art, culture, and human relationships after discovering that her most profound experiences had been orchestrated by criminals who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push to maintain her compliance. The paintings she had purchased with such pride were revealed to be worthless forgeries, but more devastating was the recognition that her emotional responses to them had been genuine, even though the circumstances of their acquisition had been entirely false. Catherine's recovery became a model for treating other network survivors who struggled with similar challenges. Traditional approaches to addiction treatment proved inadequate for addressing the complex psychological manipulation that had characterized their experiences. These individuals needed to learn not just how to live without drugs, but how to trust their own judgment and emotional responses after years of systematic deception. The treatment approach developed for network survivors incorporated techniques that would later influence therapeutic methods for treating victims of other forms of psychological manipulation and coercive control. The recognition that addiction could be weaponized as part of broader manipulation schemes created new understanding of how criminal organizations could exploit human vulnerability for purposes that extended far beyond simple financial gain. Dr. Edmund Whitfield, a psychiatrist who worked with network survivors at a facility in Switzerland, documented patterns of psychological damage that he termed manufactured dependency syndrome. His patients had been systematically conditioned to associate their most meaningful experiences with situations controlled by their manipulators, creating forms of psychological bondage that persisted long after the physical addiction had been addressed. Dr. Whitfield's research revealed that network operators had developed sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed them to create artificial emotional dependencies that were often more powerful than chemical addiction. Patients who successfully overcame their drug dependencies often continued to crave the social connections, and cultural experiences that had been provided through network participation, even after understanding that those connections had been deliberately manufactured for exploitative purposes. The challenge of treating manufactured dependency syndrome required therapeutic approaches that helped patients develop authentic relationships and genuine cultural interests, while processing the trauma of discovering that their most cherished experiences had been systematically fabricated. The process often took years and required careful attention to preventing patients from simply replacing their network dependencies with new forms of artificial connection. Jean-Baptiste Moreau's recovery exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of treatment for network survivors. His cooperation with authorities had earned him access to experimental treatment programs that combined medical intervention for his heroin addiction with psychological therapy designed to address the manipulation he had experienced. But his artistic career faced challenges that extended far beyond his personal recovery. The painting Jean-Baptiste had created while using heroin possessed qualities that critics and collectors found compelling. But his work produced during recovery lacked the otherworldly intensity that had made his addicted periods seem so artistically significant. This created a cruel dilemma. His best work had been produced under conditions that were destroying his life, while his healthiest periods produced art that seemed mundane by comparison. Jean-Baptiste's struggle with this artistic dilemma became a subject of intense debate within recovery communities and legitimate art circles. Some argued that his heroin-influenced work should be celebrated as authentic artistic expression that happened to emerge from tragic circumstances. Others contended that celebrating art produced through criminal exploitation perpetuated the romanticization of addiction and manipulation that had made network recruitment possible. The debate reflected broader questions about how society should evaluate cultural achievements that emerged from destructive or exploitative circumstances. If genuine artistic innovation had resulted from systematic criminal manipulation, how should that innovation be understood and preserved? Could the artistic value be separated from the criminal context? Or did acknowledging the art's significance somehow validate the methods used to produce it? These questions became practically urgent as legitimate galleries and collectors struggled to determine how to handle network-associated artworks that had been seized during the investigation. Some pieces possessed genuine artistic merit that had been recognized by critics who were unaware of the criminal circumstances surrounding their creation. Others were revealed to be mediocre works whose perceived value had been artificially inflated through the manipulation of buyers whose judgment had been compromised by addiction and psychological manipulation. The art market's response to network-associated works created a new category of cultural artifacts whose value was complicated by their association with criminal activity. Some collectors who had purchased works through legitimate channels found their investments worthless when the criminal connections were revealed. Others discovered that pieces they had dismissed as overpriced had actually been genuine masterworks, whose value had been obscured by the scandals surrounding their origins. Professor Elena Hichter, an art historian from Vienna who had been studying the relationship between creativity and altered consciousness, found her own research complicated by the network revelations. Her academic work had suggested that certain forms of drug use could enhance artistic creativity, but the discovery that systematic criminal exploitation had influenced many of the works she had studied forced her to reconsider her conclusions about the synergistic relationship between chemical enhancement and authentic artistic expression. Professor Rita's dilemma reflected challenges faced by scholars throughout Europe who had been studying cultural movements and artistic innovations that were later revealed to have been influenced by criminal manipulation. Academic work that had seemed to provide objective analysis of cultural phenomena was called into question when the criminal context became apparent, forcing researchers to distinguish between genuine artistic innovation and manufactured cultural significance. The academic community's response to these challenges led to new standards for research into cultural movements and artistic communities. Scholars developed techniques for identifying potential criminal influence in cultural phenomena, while academic institutions established protocols for addressing research that might have been compromised by criminal manipulation of subjects or data sources. The broader cultural impact of the network's exposure extended far beyond academic circles. The revelation that sophisticated criminal organizations could systematically exploit artistic communities created suspicion about avant-garde cultural movements and experimental artistic practices. Public support for arts funding and cultural institutions declined as taxpayers questioned whether their money might be supporting activities that could be infiltrated by criminal organizations. This cultural backlash had devastating effects on legitimate artists and cultural institutions that had no connection to network activities. Experimental theaters, avant-garde galleries, and innovative cultural programs found themselves facing reduced funding and public suspicion simply because they represented the kinds of activities that criminal organizations had learned to exploit for their own purposes. The backlash was particularly severe in Paris, where the café culture that had given the city its reputation for artistic innovation became associated with criminal exploitation and social destruction. Tourism declined as visitors who had once been attracted by Paris' bohemian atmosphere began to view the city's cultural offerings with suspicion and fear. Maurice Daler, who had owned a legitimate café near the Spawn that had served as a gathering place for artists and intellectuals without any connection to network activities, found his business destroyed by association with the scandal. Customers who had once appreciated his establishment's authentic bohemian atmosphere now viewed any café that attracted artists as potentially dangerous, forcing him to close a business that had operated successfully for 15 years. Maurice's experience reflected the broader damage that the network's activities had inflicted on legitimate cultural institutions and businesses throughout Paris. The systematic exploitation of café culture had created suspicion about authentic cultural activities that made it difficult for legitimate operators to maintain their businesses or attract customers who might be associated with artistic communities. The economic impact extended beyond individual businesses to affect entire neighborhoods that had been associated with artistic and intellectual culture. Property values declined in areas like Montmartre and Manors as the romantic associations that had attracted residents and visitors were replaced by concerns about criminal activity and social danger. The neighborhood decline was accelerated by the departure of legitimate artists and intellectuals who found themselves unable to pursue their work in environments that had become associated with criminal exploitation. The authentic cultural communities that had made these areas attractive were dispersed, leaving behind empty studios and abandoned gathering places that served as monuments to the network's destructive impact. The heroin havens of 1920s Paris had finally fallen silent, but their echoes would reverberate through history for decades to come. What began as bohemian dreams in smoke-filled cafes had revealed itself as one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies ever to exploit human creativity and vulnerability for destructive purposes. The true tragedy wasn't just the lives lost to overdoses or the fortunes drained by systematic exploitation. It was the corruption of everything that made artistic culture worth preserving. The trust between mentor and student, the genuine search for meaning through creative expression, and the communities that should have nurtured human potential instead of destroying it. The network's collapse left a generation of survivors struggling to rebuild not just their lives, but their understanding of art, relationships, and authenticity itself. Yet, from this devastation emerged crucial insights about how criminal organizations could weaponize culture, exploit vulnerability, and threaten the very foundations of democratic society. The lessons learned from these heroin havens would prove essential as the world faced new forms of psychological manipulation and social exploitation in the decades that followed. The cafes where dreams went to die had become laboratories for understanding how easily human nature could be corrupted and how vigilantly free. Societies must guard against those who would exploit our highest aspirations for their lowest purposes.